Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So in today's video, I'm going to be doing my 2024 book review. I think this year I read a total of 18 books. So I'm going to just be going over some of my reviews, my opinions, and of course showing you my top book of the year. If you're not already, be sure to subscribe to this channel to see more vlog and book related content. But if you are strictly looking for book content from me, be sure to follow my TikTok and my Bookstagram. Both are in the bio. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I don't know if I said this at the beginning, but this year I read a total of 18 books, which for me is a little bit low, but I also feel like I really was super engaged with my books this year. I feel like I read a lot of really good books. So I'm not too upset with the low number. I also feel like, maybe an unpopular opinion, I don't feel like you have to read books fast, despite of how it seems on social media. If you read 1 book, 5 books, 150 books, all numbers are valid. But anyways, I think I'm going to start off with my most recent because I literally finished it last night. So my review is fresh. So my most recent read was actually my most anticipated read for 2024. And that is Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family. So if you haven't heard about what this book is about already, basically it's about the Galvin family in like the 1960s, 1970s. And in their family, they have 12 kids. They have 10 boys and 2 girls. And out of the 10 boys, 6 of them suffer with mental health issues, specifically schizophrenia. So in this book, they kind of they dive into the family dynamics, the siblings, as well as kind of getting into the siblings who are not affected by mental health issues. But they also kind of talk about schizophrenia in general, kind of the discovery of schizophrenia, as well as sort of like the trials and pharmaceuticals that go into finding a treatment and or cure for schizophrenia. It is really interesting, especially if you're like me and you're really into psychology and mental health issues. So if you are fascinated with this, I would highly recommend. I didn't give this book a review because I feel like it's always hard to give non-fiction a book like an actual review, but I do think it was really well done. I do think it gets a bit technical at times, but I wouldn't let that deter you. I think it's a really fascinating book, especially if you are studying psychology, especially abnormal psychology. Really go ahead and get Hidden Valley Road. Highly recommend. Okay, so I'm gonna try and go in order of how I read these books, so bear with me. But the next book that I read this year was The Girls. This is also a book that I was really looking forward to this year. It is about a young girl and she joins a cult. But something about this book, I don't know what I would rate this book, maybe 3 out of 5. The one thing about this book that I wasn't expecting is they didn't really go in too much about the cult itself and like their beliefs and things like that. This book is loosely based on the Manson family, which I think is really interesting. But like I said, they didn't talk about the cult much. They kind of just talked about kind of like girls, which is I guess obvious from the title, but just like girls and like their influences on other girls and kind of like what it means to be a young woman in society. So it was interesting. I feel like there could have been more, but that's just me. I would say it's up there on some of my favorite books this year. But yeah, that was The Girls by Emma Cline. We're jumping around a little bit, but I think the next book that I read this year was What Made Maddie Run. I saw a lot of TikTok comments about this book and I have to say I was blown away. So this is about Maddie Holloran, and she was a college athlete. Specifically, I think she did track and cross country, and it kind of goes into her life and what it meant to be kind of like a collegiate athlete. Unfortunately, in her first year, she ends up committing suicide. So it kind of talks about what led up to that, why, what was the reason. I found this book extremely interesting, especially as someone like myself who did not grow up doing sports. I was more of an arts girly, and so hearing about the athlete mindset was really interesting to me, especially because one opinion that I had that I talked about on my Bookstagram is that a lot of traits that make good athletes I don't feel like are conducive to everyday life. So it was really interesting seeing the author and just her family in general praise certain behaviors that to me sounded like really huge red flags, but that's all in hindsight. But yeah, it's a really interesting book. It's a really sad book, but I would highly recommend, especially if you are going into college, if you have an athlete or if a child who's an athlete and is going into college and is thinking about doing athletics post-secondary. I would highly recommend What Made Maddie Run. Okay, so the next book that I read this year is The Motivation Myth by Jeff Hayden. I actually started reading this book at the very beginning of the year, and it took me like 7 or 8 months to get through it. I really thought and I was hoping I would like this book, but I really didn't. I found that there were some things that were interesting, like I have a few tabs, but honestly I found that some of the advice was a bit superficial, if not a bit problematic. Like there was a whole chapter on losing weight and the tips were questionable in my opinion. But anyways, if you are looking to dive into fashion, especially with the new year coming up, maybe pick it up. It wasn't for me, but maybe it will be for you. So that was The Motivation Myth by Jeff Hayden. So another book that I read this year is Latfona. I don't know. Again, saw this on TikTok, picked it up, and this book was so questionable. I didn't really know what to expect when I picked it up and read the back, but it was so weird and gross, and like the title says, or like the review says, debauched. It was just a bit crazy. I really don't know how to review this book either. If you read it, you know, but I don't know. It kind of just talks about this boy named Merrick who lives in this like really weird and decrepit village, and he gets invited to stay at one of the, I guess, like king castles. It kind of just talks about what he goes through there as well as what happens in his village while he's gone, and it's just like really strange. It's really weird, very disturbing. There's a lot of scenes in there that is really questionable, but anyways, I guess it's a little bit fun. I have a few tabs on it, mainly just things that I was just like, what the fuck. But anyways, that was Latfona. Maybe recommend if you're into really weird books. So another book I read this year was a classic, and I read The Great Gatsby. I mainly read this because when I was in university, no, I mainly read The Great Gatsby because when I was in high school, this was not one of our assigned books, strangely enough. So I decided to read it, give it a go, because people were talking about it and I never really know what they're talking about when they mention The Great Gatsby. Now I do. It was okay. Like I had a loose idea of what it was about, but I feel like it still didn't hit. Like I don't know, maybe I was just missing something. I know in 2025 I want to read more classics, so maybe I'll have a better understanding on how to analyze them later, but it was okay. It was alright. I don't even know, quite frankly, what it was about. You know, one of those books you just read, you're like, I don't really know what I just read. But anyways, at some points it was interesting, some points it was not. This one also took a little bit of time to get through, I would feel like, and I feel like the ending was just so abrupt, which I wasn't a huge fan of. But anyways, that was The Great Gatsby. I feel like it's also a really easy classic to get into if you are looking to start getting into classics. So for that reason, maybe I'll recommend. But anyways, that was A Great Gatsby. The next book that I read this year was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. But I've also been recommended this book a lot through TikTok, and I gave it a go. It was okay. It's an interesting concept. It's about people who have superpowers, but the powers, like basically when you encounter a near-death experience, you get these like crazy sub-natural abilities, and they're basically hunting the person who came up with this idea or something like that. So it's a cool concept, but I feel like it could have been done better. I know this book has a sequel that kind of sounds interesting, but I'm not entirely sure if I'm gonna go ahead and read it. But that was Vicious by V.E. Schwab, and I can't remember what I gave this book, but anyways, that was Vicious. The next book is Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. Again, recommended this book. You guessed it, from TikTok, and this book was okay. I think this was the book that really was like, I think I'm done with TikTok recommendations, specifically TikTok like romance book recommendations, and I think I'm going to switch to more literary. I don't know, but this book was alright. I feel like if this would have been a book that I would really like if I was like 13 again. It was just a bit young for me, which I thought was surprising because there was a lot of people who were like in their mid-20s and older who really enjoyed this book. It's an interesting concept, and I think it's better than some like fantasy romance books that I read, but it's not the best. It wasn't my favorite. Again, this book also has a sequel. Not entirely sure if I'm gonna read it or not, because I have heard that the sequel was pretty good, but again, I don't know if I have it in me. But that was Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. So the next book that I read is The Idiot by Elf Watchman. I think so you pronounce her name, or their name, don't know. But anyways, this book was actually really good. I actually really liked this one. It was a bit confusing at times, I will say. It's kind of about, it's about this girl named Celine who goes to school where Harvard, and she kind of gets, I think it's like the first time of her encountering kids who are smarter, if not more smarter than she is, and it's kind of her dealing with that and discovering new things, meeting new people, learning a new language, going to new places, and it's just like a really fun reminiscent period good for me of like what it's like to be in my first year of university again. But yeah, it was a really interesting book. I liked it. There was a lot of big words in it that I have definitely had to look up, but I thought it was fun. Yeah, I can't remember when I gave it again. I should, once I edit this video, maybe I'll put the reading on the screen. But yeah, that was The Idiot by Elf Bachman, and I enjoyed it. Okay, so the next book I read this year is another nonfiction, and is Educated by Tara Westover. And this is about a girl who grew up in, I want to say Utah, in this kind of like strange family who didn't necessarily believe in education. And it kind of talks about her journey to becoming educated. And what it was like growing up kind of cut off from society and cut off from, you guessed it, education. It's a fascinating book. I think one of my only critique that I had with this, if I remember, is that they didn't really talk about how she like got to where she is. I think she finished the book with a PhD, but it didn't really talk much about like what it took to get there, if that made sense. It was kind of just like, okay, now I'm in school now. It didn't talk too much about like how she studied or how she started to learn new things and like get to the point that she was at. They dived into it a little bit, but I wish they dived in a little bit deeper. But either way, I thought Educated was a really good book. I know her mom actually came out with a rebuttal to her story and basically just called Tara a liar, which is crazy. But yeah, I would highly recommend Educated, especially if you were in school and you need some inspiration. Educated by Tara Westover. The next book I read this year, actually I kind of forgot about, but I ended up reading Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkinson. This one was actually pretty good. I think I forgot again what I rated it. I'll put it here. I read this at the beginning of the year, so to be honest, the next few books that I read that I'm about to review, I read them like the later half of the year, so I really don't remember what it was about or what I thought. But from what I remember, it's about two kids named Brendan and Benny, and when their mother passes away, they're kind of forced to reconnect through this black cake recipe. And if you're Caribbean, you know what black cake is, but basically they're forced to reconnect and rekindle. There is like a bit of family drama that happened with the siblings and why they're not talking, so they're kind of forced to rekindle that relationship, and as well as go through their late mother's life. And they found out a lot of really interesting and unexpected things about her. But yeah, it was a really good book. I think this has movie associated, or a show, I think is on Hulu. Haven't watched it, maybe I will next year. But yeah, that was Black Cake. Sorry for a non-comprehensive review. I don't really remember what it was about, but from what I remember, I liked it. So the next two books are part of a series that I started last year, and again, you guessed it, found it through TikTok, but that is, I read the Hawthorne Legacy and the Final Gambit, and this is part of the Inheritance Games trilogy. I have the first one on my shelf. So yeah, I read these two earlier this year and I thought they were okay. I feel like the story is interesting, the concept is interesting about this girl who inherits this inheritance when she turns 18, but the only catch is to get the inheritance, she has to survive 1 year of her living on his estate. And on his estate, there's like a whole bunch of twists and turns. If I remember correctly, I think the second book was really well done, and the third book just kind of fell flat. Like how they ended up tying the whole story together, in my opinion, was just a little bit too loose. I think they should have tightened it up a little bit. But yeah, I think there's like 3 other books that are kind of part of this series. Again, don't know if I'm going to continue reading, but from what I remember, it was alright. I think it would be a book, like I said, kind of similar to the Once Upon a Broken Heart, where I think if I was like 13 again, I would be obsessed, but because I'm like now 27, it doesn't really hit the same. But I read the last 2 books of the Inheritance Games. Next book that I read this year is Yellowface by R.F. Vaughan, and this is probably one of my favorite books of the year, outside of the 2 that I'm going to show you later. But I actually really enjoyed this book. I've seen this a lot over the last few years, and I finally gave it a go. It was so interesting, but so infuriating. Basically, it's about this main character who, after witnessing her friend dying, unfortunately, she steals her manuscript for her next novel and then publishes it as her own. So it kind of dives into what's it, author integrity and what it means to have original work, as well as what does it mean to, you know, tell diverse stories. Do you have to be, you know, if you're telling the story of a main character who's black, do you have to be a black author? It goes into a lot of stuff, as well as what it takes to get a book published, which I thought was really interesting, as well as cancel culture. So if you're into all of those things, I would highly recommend. I know some people didn't like Yellowface, which I was surprised by, maybe because I know the main character was so annoying. like, oh my gosh, but I think that was done on purpose. And so I would highly recommend R.F. Kuang's Yellow Face, and I'm really excited because next year I'm going to be reading her really popular book, Babel. I think I'm going to do a whole video on my TBR for next year, but Yellow Face, the next book that I read, these next two were literally at the beginning of the year. But the first one was These Violent Delights, and it's kind of like a modern Romeo Juliet type of thing. It takes place in Shanghai and kind of goes into the two rival gangs, and I think the son and the daughter of the two rival gangs are they have a little thing going on, or they did, and then they don't, and then they do. So that is this book. Again, I think similar to some of the other TikTok recommendations, this would have been good if I was younger, but now that I'm older, I'm not a huge fan, which I think is, again, so surprising to me because a lot of people my age really do like these books. But I'm thinking I'm not a huge fan of fantasy, or at least modern fantasy, I think. But anyways, this book was, again, all right. I think is better than like was it Something of a Broken Heart? Once Upon a Broken Heart. I think this one was a little bit better, but it wasn't the best. It was, yeah, I don't know. It was okay. I also feel like it was extremely long for no reason. But anyway, there is a sequel. Again, I don't know if I'm gonna end up reading it, but anyway, maybe give it a go. This book I read at the very beginning of the year, and it's probably one of the most popular books on TikTok, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. And this book was a huge disappointment to me. It was good in the sense that the plot was good, the storyline was good, but I don't think the writing was as good as people made it to be. I think the first like 3/4 of this book were slow, and I think they packed all the action in the last the last little bit of the book, which again I don't particularly like. Again, I also don't think I'm a huge fan of fantasy, as well as kind of like smutty fantasy. I also have a huge gripe with smut books. Maybe I'll talk about it in another video. But yeah, and like romance in general, I don't think I like modern romance books either, so it wasn't for me. I know there's several sequels, but the length and like the depth of the books, I don't know if I'll get into it. Maybe one day, I don't know. But that was A Court of Thorns and Roses, but it wasn't for me. Okay, so another book that I read this year is kind of like Lap Fauna in the sense that it's like really weird, but I read A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. This book was I actually really liked it. It was really disturbing, but it was really interesting. This is about a female serial killer who is also a food critic and also dabbles in cannibalism. It is so good, really interesting, very disturbing and graphic, but something I also really like, which is a bit niche, but while I was reading this book, I was also studying for the GRE, and there's a lot of key terms in this book, so it made it really easy to study for the vocab. But yeah, I really recommend that one, especially if you're into really weird books, but not as weird as Lap Fauna. I would recommend A Certain Hunger. Okay, you guys, we've made it to the end, and I'm going to show you my 2 favorite books of the year, if I haven't already. I don't think I did, but I'm going to show you my second favorite, and then my very close companion first favorite. So my second favorite book of the year was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I've seen this book around my bookstore for many years, and I picked it up, put it down, picked it up, put it down, finally picked it up, and oh my god, I don't know why it took me so long to read it. This book is about 2 sisters and their experience during World War II, as well as France in the middle of the Holocaust, in the middle of like World War II, and what they have to deal with. And something that I really love about her books is that a lot of them are female centered, and it kind of talks about female empowerment and strength and resilience, and it's just so good. And this book is so sad. Now, something I should have said at the beginning is that in all my years of reading, I read so much growing up. I've never cried over a book, literally never. Didn't cry in either of these 2 books, but I think honestly they just caught me on a right day. I think if it was on my period or if it was late at night, I probably would have been sobbing. But these books are this book is so good. I would highly recommend. It's a little long, and it does, I know this one takes a bit of time to get it going, but once you get going, so good. And she definitely knows how to wrap a book. My god, does she know how to wrap a book. So The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, I would highly recommend her. Okay, if you've made it this far, I probably will like put a little chapter at the very end if you just want to see my favorite book. But my favorite book, also by Kristen Hanna this year, was The Great Alone. This one was shocking. I read The Nightingale earlier and loved it. That was my favorite book of the year, and then people on TikTok were like, if you like The Nightingale, read The Great Alone. And this one kind of slid above it, slid right above it. This book was so good. It is about a mother, well, mainly a girl who lives in Alaska with her mom and dad, and they quickly realized like how isolating and how scary, I guess is the one way I can describe it, it is living in the kind of like middle of nowhere in Alaska, especially through the winter. And it kind of talks about, you know, female empowerment, resilience, and like just to be a woman in that situation. And also I also found both in The Nightingale and Great Alone, it also talks about how much women help other women in situations of crisis like this. But it's so good, so tragic, so sad. Oh my god, the end was so sad. It was one of those books that left you just breathless. It left you so, I don't even know, like just sad. Oh, sad. Oh, but this book was so good. I would highly recommend. She's so good. Love you, Chris and Hannah. Love you. The Great Alone, favorite book of the year. Okay, so that is the end of my 2024 book list. Everything that I read this year. I hope you guys enjoyed. I think in 2025 I really want to make more book content. Reading is so important to me and it's such a huge part of my life, especially this year and going forward, so I definitely want to share more of my reads. If you have recommendations for me for 2025, please let me know. I will definitely be doing a quick little like 2025 book haul because I did get a few little books that I really wanted to show you guys. But yeah, if you're not already, like I said, be sure to subscribe to this channel, follow me on TikTok, and follow my Bookstagram as well as my personal Instagram. And yeah, with all that being said, when I'm filming this, it is literally Christmas Eve, so I hope you guys had a really great holiday or Christmas or whatever you celebrate, and I'll see you guys later. Bye guys.